Captain Avery Quinn had never felt more out of place in her life. The sleek, glass-like walls of the Shindari flagship shimmered in the dim lighting, reflecting her every move. She stood at the center of the grand hall, surrounded by towering figures who were watching her intently. The Shindari, a species far older and more advanced than humanity, had a reputation for their strict and often bizarre rituals, but nothing could have prepared Quinn for this. She had been told that today's ceremony was a simple diplomatic exchange, a formal greeting to the Shindari leadership as they discussed trade, exploration, and alliances. But what the Shindari had planned was far more complex. Quinn, always sharp and prepared, had dressed in the formal attire required for such meetings, elegant, but not flashy. But as soon as the ceremony began, things quickly spiraled into the unexpected. The towering leader of the Shindari, Aegon Tharkal, stepped forward. His pale green skin glowed under the lights, and his deep-set eyes studied her like a predator, examining its prey. His presence was overwhelming. There was no hiding from the intensity of his gaze. "You are a human," Aegon's voice echoed, each word carrying weight, "and thus, you must prove your worth to us. You will participate in the revelation of truth, a sacred ritual that reveals your true nature. Only through your full honesty can you stand before us as an equal." Quinn stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what he had just said. The revelation of truth was a custom she had read about briefly in the briefing materials. The Shindari believed that one could only be trusted by revealing their most vulnerable state, something their society deemed essential for establishing true connections. But the last part of Aegon's statement left Quinn confused. "What does that mean?" she asked, trying to sound confident. Aegon's gaze never wavered. "You must uncover yourself, reveal your true form so that we may see your honesty. Only then can we decide if you, and by extension, your species, are worthy of our alliance." A murmur spread through the room as Quinn's stomach dropped. The meaning was clear. She had to strip down to her undergarments. She had heard of cultures with unusual customs, but this was another level. Quinn, for all her training, had never faced something like this. It wasn't just the physical act that caught her off guard, it was the sheer audacity of the demand. To them, it was a simple test, a matter of showing who you truly were. To her, it was an invasion of personal space and dignity. But she couldn't let that show. Not now, not in front of them. Refusing wasn't an option. She knew how much the Shindari valued their rituals. To defy this could be disastrous not just for her, but for the entire human race. She had no choice but to comply. Yet, something deep inside her stirred. She could feel her heart pounding. This wasn't just about humiliation or pride, it was a challenge, and Quinn loved challenges. Without a word, she unbuttoned her jacket. Slowly, deliberately, her movements steady despite the tension rising in the room. As she removed her outer garments, she kept her posture tall, her head high. The Shindari watched her with a mix of curiosity and cold detachment. They didn't see a human woman, just a subject to study, to assess, but Quinn refused to let them see her as weak. Her strength came from her ability to adapt, to think on her feet. She wasn't going to let them break her. The moment she stood in her undershirt and pants, a loud voice broke the silence. It was Aegon again, speaking from his throne-like seat. "You see now, human," Aegon's words seemed to slice through the air. "You have bared yourself to us. And now, you will make your choice. You will marry me, or you will face the consequences." A gasp spread through the assembly. Quinn's mind raced. Marriage? She was caught off guard. This was more than just a cultural misunderstanding, it was a demand, a threat. Her throat tightened. The weight of Aegon's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. "You must marry me," Aegon continued, his voice cold. "For only in this union will our peoples be at peace. Refuse, and your crew will be destroyed. Your people will know nothing but war." Quinn's heart skipped a beat. The consequences he spoke of were not just political, they were personal. He was offering her a choice: become his bride and secure peace, or refuse and face an intergalactic war. It was an ultimatum she never expected. She couldn't let this happen. her crew, her mission, they were depending on her. But Quinn also knew that if she agreed to this alien leader's demands, she would forever be bound to him and his people in a way that she could never escape. And while the stakes were high, she couldn't make such an important decision on impulse. She needed time to think, to assess. That's not how diplomacy works, Quinn finally said, her voice steady, though her mind was swirling. You cannot force someone into marriage. You don't understand us, or you wouldn't make such an absurd demand. Aegon's eyes flashed, a slight smile tugging at his lips. You misunderstand, human. This is not a request. It is the way of the Sindari. A challenge, a test. If you fail, your people will suffer. If you accept, we will stand together. Quinn clenched her fists. She couldn't just let it end here, not like this. She had to find a way out. You think you can break me with your customs? She said, her voice rising slightly, carrying the defiance she felt deep within. I will never bow to you. Not in body, and certainly not in spirit. Aegon's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. Then prepare for what is to come, Captain Quinn. You have chosen your path. We will see if your people are as strong as you claim. The room fell into an eerie silence, the tension so thick it was almost palpable. Quinn stood in the center, still defiant, but inside, she was already planning. She needed to buy time to speak with her crew, time to reach out to Earth. Aegon's threats were not something she could dismiss lightly, but she would find a way to turn the situation to her advantage. She wasn't about to let an alien leader dictate her fate. Not now, not ever. She would find another way. Captain Avery Quinn paced restlessly in her quarters aboard the Scindarii flagship. The soft hum of the ship's advanced systems barely reached her ears. Her mind, however, was in overdrive. The ultimatum Aegon Tharkal had given her, marry him or risk the destruction of her people, was more than just a threat. It was a trap, a political maneuver. But Quinn was not one to give in easily. She had faced worse than this. The stakes were higher now, but she wasn't about to let Aegon's demands decide her fate. She couldn't just refuse and walk away. Not with the entire human delegation depending on her. But the idea of marrying an alien leader to save her people didn't sit well with her. It felt wrong, and deep down, Quinn knew it would change everything. Aegon had to be made to understand that humans weren't so easily broken by fear or threats. As she sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the map of the Scindarii ship's internal layout, she heard the familiar knock on her door. It was her second-in-command, Lieutenant Marcus Holloway. Captain, it's time to get a strategy in motion, Holloway said, stepping into the room. His face was grim, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a serious intensity. I'm listening, Quinn replied, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the situation. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. If we refuse to comply, the Sindari will see it as an act of war. We have no idea how powerful they really are. Holloway's voice held a note of concern. They've kept most of their military capabilities hidden, and I'm afraid we're walking into a storm. Quinn nodded. She had seen the reports. The Sindari military might was legendary, but it was their political power that posed the greater danger. The council was divided, and Aegon's rule was far from secure. I'm not marrying him, Marcus, Quinn said, her voice low but firm. That's out of the question. Holloway raised an eyebrow. Then we have to figure out another way to handle this. We can't afford to lose the human delegation, and we can't allow Aegon to walk all over us. We won't lose, Quinn replied confidently. I have a plan. She wasn't entirely sure if she believed that herself, but she couldn't let doubt creep in now. The Sindari were a dangerous species, but humans had something they didn't. A unique ability to think outside the box. They adapted to new situations and found solutions where others saw none. Quinn trusted her crew, and she trusted her own instincts. Over the next few hours, Quinn and Holloway worked in secret, developing a plan to buy them time. They would not confront Aegon directly for now. That would be suicide. Instead, they needed to sow doubt in his mind, create a situation where he would second-guess his own decision to force Quinn into marriage. Quinn knew that Aegon's arrogance was his weakness. The Jindari leader believed himself to be untouchable, above any challenge. But Quinn had seen cracks in his armor. There was something more to him than just the cold, calculating ruler he appeared to be. If she could find a way to exploit those cracks, she might be able to turn the tables. "We'll need to get information about their military capabilities," Quinn said, looking over the plans Holloway had brought her. "If we can expose some vulnerability, it might give us leverage. But we also need to get the message back to Earth. I need to know we have backup if things go south. We'll send a secure transmission first thing in the morning," Holloway assured her. "But we'll need to be careful. The Zindari have a way of tracking transmissions. If we're not discreet, they'll know we're plotting against them." Quinn frowned. The danger was real, but she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. "Then we do it the old-fashioned way. We send a message that won't be traced." Holloway raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You've got a plan?" Quinn smiled slightly, the first sign of hope in days. "I've got an idea." The next morning, Quinn and Holloway moved swiftly. They had found a hidden comms room deep in the heart of the ship, one that the Jindari didn't seem to monitor closely. It was isolated, secure, and perfect for sending their encrypted message back to Earth without drawing attention. But as Quinn sat in front of the console, fingers hovering over the controls, a sense of unease crept in. The thought of sending a message to Earth felt like a lifeline, but it was also a gamble. She wasn't sure what kind of response they would get. Would Earth send a fleet to rescue them? Would they be able to stop Aegon's plans? Or would the Jindari intercept the message and destroy any chance of survival? She shook her head. She couldn't afford to think like that. She had to stay focused on the task at hand. Quinn and Holloway worked quickly, coding the message in a way that would make it seem like a routine transmission about trade updates. It was a clever ruse, one that would hopefully pass under the radar of the Jindari surveillance systems. Once it was sent, they could only wait. With the message dispatched, Quinn and Holloway returned to their quarters, where Quinn continued to plan. They couldn't afford to sit back and wait for help. Time was running out. As she reviewed the ship's layout once more, she had an idea. The Jindari were known for their reliance on technology. But there was one thing they didn't have: human creativity. The Jindari had their strengths, but humans had something that they lacked: the ability to improvise in the face of uncertainty. Quinn smiled to herself. She was going to make that work to her advantage. Later that day, Aegon summoned her to the Grand Hall once again. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her spine stiffen. He was expecting her to bow, to submit to his will, but Quinn refused to give him that satisfaction. "Captain Quinn," Aegon said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of impatience. "You've made your position clear. But understand, this refusing me is not just a rejection of my offer. It is a declaration of war against my people. If you continue to defy me, the consequences will be dire." "I'm not here to negotiate with you, Aegon," Quinn replied, her voice firm, standing tall in front of him. "I'm here to ensure the survival of my people. You don't scare me." Aegon's eyes narrowed. There was something almost curious in his gaze now. He hadn't expected her to remain so defiant. But that was exactly what Quinn wanted. "You think you can continue to defy me without consequence?" Aegon's voice was low, threatening. But Quinn wasn't intimidated. "I think you don't know what humans are capable of," Quinn said evenly. "And I think you're about to find out." The tension between them hung thick in the air. Aegon regarded her for a long moment before speaking again, his tone almost mocking. "You may be a bold one, Captain Quinn. But you will soon learn that defying the Jindari comes at a price. You'll either bend to my will or face the consequences of your foolish pride." Quinn stared back at him without flinching. "I'd rather face the consequences than lose my honor." Aegon's eyes darkened. "Very well. You've made your choice. But know this: your people will not escape unscathed." "I'll take my chances," Quinn said, turning to leave. "But we'll see who truly comes out on top in the end." As Quinn exited the room, she felt a rush of determination. The game had only just begun. and she was ready for whatever came next. Captain Avery Quinn stood on the bridge of the Zindari flagship, her mind racing as she watched the swirling vortex of stars outside the viewport. The ship's hum was constant, the steady pulse of its engines reminding her that time was moving forward whether she was ready or not. She had faced pressure before, missions that seemed impossible, challenges that could have broken others, but nothing had ever felt like this. Aegon Tharkal's threat still hung in the air like a storm cloud. Marry him, or face the wrath of the Shindari. The ultimatum had been made, but Quinn had refused to let herself be intimidated. Today, however, she knew the time had come. The first part of her plan had been set into motion. She had sent a covert message to Earth's fleet, asking for backup and providing an update on the situation. But she couldn't just sit back and wait. The Zindari were powerful, but Quinn had something they didn't: the human ability to adapt and improvise. She just needed to find the right moment. She turned away from the viewport, meeting the eyes of her crew, who were working quietly at their stations. They were all fully aware of the situation, but Quinn refused to let them see how badly she was feeling. Her calm demeanor was all they had to go on, and she wasn't about to break. Lieutenant Marcus Holloway, her second in command, approached her with a datapad in hand. He had been invaluable since the moment they landed on the Sindarii ship, and Quinn trusted him with her life. "Captain, we've gathered more intel on their defenses," Holloway said, his voice low. "The Sindarii have a fleet stationed at the edge of this system. If they decide to attack, we'll be outnumbered and outgunned. But we've found something interesting. There's a weak point in their security grid. It's a small gap, but it's there." Quinn's eyes narrowed. "A gap? How small?" "Small enough to get through unnoticed if we move fast enough. It's a part of their military network that hasn't been fully integrated with the rest of their systems. It's not exactly a blind spot, but it's an opening we can use to our advantage." Quinn felt a spark of hope. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been looking for. But there was a catch. If they were caught, it could mean the end of their mission. Or worse. But Quinn wasn't afraid of taking risks. It was the only way to win against the Sindarii. "We can use this to our advantage," she said, her voice steady. "We'll need to act fast, and we can't afford to be seen. Holloway, gather the team. We'll make a plan, and then we move." Holloway nodded and quickly set to work, organizing the crew for the mission. Quinn felt the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. If they succeeded, it could be their ticket to freedom. But if they failed, there would be no second chance. There would be no escape. Hours later, Quinn and her team were gathered in a hidden part of the Shindari flagship. The ship's cold, metallic corridors seemed even more eerie when they moved through them quietly, knowing that every step could be their last. Quinn's pulse raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. They were in enemy territory, but she wasn't about to back down now. "Ready?" Quinn asked, glancing over at Holloway, who gave her a quick nod. "Let's do this," Holloway replied, his voice full of determination. The plan was simple. They would infiltrate the part of the ship that controlled the Zindari's communication network. From there, they would plant a virus that would disrupt their ability to track the humans and prevent them from sending reinforcements. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best shot they had. The crew moved silently through the ship, avoiding guards and surveillance cameras. Quinn kept her head down, her mind focused on the mission. She didn't have time to think about the consequences. If they failed, the Sindarii would have everything they needed to crush the human delegation. If they succeeded, it would give them the leverage they needed to negotiate from a position of strength. They reached the entrance to the control room, a large, heavily guarded chamber that housed the core of the Shindari's military communications. Quinn felt her heart race as they prepared to breach the door. She glanced at her team, each of them ready for the challenge. "On my mark," she whispered. 1, 2, 3. With a single motion, Quinn activated the EMP device she had smuggled in, disabling the ship's security systems for a brief moment. The door to the control room slid open, and the team moved inside, guns drawn. They didn't have much time. The EMP would only give them a few minutes before the Jindari systems rebooted. Quinn quickly moved to the central terminal, her fingers flying across the interface. She wasn't a computer expert, but she had learned enough during her time in the military to get by. She inserted the virus into the terminal, praying that it would work. "I'm in," she said, her voice calm. "Start the countdown. We've got about 2 minutes before they notice we're here." Holloway kept watch, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. "This is too easy," he muttered, but Quinn knew better than to relax. The Sindari were too smart to let an operation like this go unnoticed for long. As she continued to work, Quinn's mind raced. The virus had to work. If it didn't, their entire mission would be compromised. She could already hear the distant sounds of footsteps in the hallway. The Zindari were coming. "I'm almost there," Quinn said, her fingers trembling as she entered the final commands. She could feel the pressure mounting, the sense of urgency tightening around her chest. The door to the control room suddenly slid open, and Quinn's heart skipped a beat. The Shindari had arrived. "Get back!" Holloway shouted as he opened fire on the incoming guards. The rest of the team quickly took cover, weapons raised. Quinn didn't look back. She focused on her task, knowing that their survival depended on her completing the virus upload. The virus was almost ready. Quinn's fingers moved faster, faster than she had ever typed before. She had no choice. Failure wasn't an option. With a final press of the button, the virus was launched. The control room's lights flickered, and Quinn knew that they had only seconds before the Shindari retaliated. Holloway's voice rang out in the chaos. "Time to go, now." Quinn didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the exit, her team close behind. They moved as fast as they could, running down the narrow hallways of the Shindari flagship. Behind them, alarms began to blare, signaling the breach. The countdown had started. "Go, go, go!" Holloway shouted, pushing the team forward. They reached the escape route, an old maintenance shaft that Quinn had identified earlier. It was their only way out, but as they climbed into the shaft, Quinn felt a jolt of panic. The Zindari were fast. Too fast. They had already locked down the ship's corridors. The entrance to the maintenance shaft was blocked. Quinn turned to Holloway, her mind racing. They had to get out. There was no other way. "They're coming," Quinn said, her voice tight with fear. "We're not done yet," Holloway said, his eyes flashing with determination. "We're not done until we make it out of here." As Quinn and her team fought their way through the corridors, dodging Zindari guards, and using every ounce of ingenuity they had, Quinn couldn't help but feel a strange sense of exhilaration. She had faced challenges before, but this felt different. This was a fight for survival. And for the first time since her mission began, Quinn felt as if she was truly in control. They had the virus. They had the leverage. But the battle was far from over. If they could get back to their ship and leave this Sindari flagship behind, they might have a chance to survive. But there were still many obstacles ahead, and as Quinn glanced back over her shoulder, she knew one thing for certain. The game had just changed, and she wasn't backing down now. Captain Avery Quinn's heart raced as she and her crew made their way through the dark, narrow maintenance shaft. The walls of the ship seemed to close in around them, the low hum of the Shindari flagship echoing through the metal corridors. Every sound was amplified. Every step felt heavier, as if the ship itself was trying to swallow them whole. The adrenaline was high. The mission had been a success so far, but the consequences of failure were looming. They had planted the virus in the Shindari communications network, causing chaos on the ship, but they hadn't been able to escape without being noticed. The alarms blared in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The countdown had begun. It was only a matter of time before the Shindari would lock down all escape routes. Quinn didn't look back. Her mind was focused on the mission, on the plan that was still in motion. They had created a window of opportunity, but it wouldn't stay open for long. If they were going to survive, they had to move quickly. She turned to her second-in-command, Lieutenant Marcus Holloway, who was moving in the rear with the rest of the crew, making sure they weren't being followed. His expression was tense, but determined. He wasn't about to let their hard work go to waste. "Any sign of pursuit?" Quinn asked in a low voice. "Not yet," Holloway replied, scanning the dark corridor ahead. "But we won't have much time. We need to get to the docking bay." "Now," Quinn nodded. The docking bay was their only chance of escape. The Scifi flagship was massive, with layers upon layers of security. But the docking bay was a more open area, less guarded. If they could get there, they could make a run for it, get back to their ship, and leave the flagship behind. But as they moved deeper into the bowels of the ship, Quinn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step seemed too quiet. The Scifi were no fools. They would have anticipated a sabotage attempt, and they wouldn't have left the crew unguarded for long. The further they went, the more the tension in the air grew. The alarms sounded again, more urgent this time. The ship's defense systems were coming online. Quinn could feel the pulse of energy around her, as if the ship itself were aware of their presence. They were running out of time. "Move faster," Quinn said, her voice cutting through the silence. "We're almost there." As they rounded a corner, they came to a dead end. The narrow hallway they were in had no visible exit. Quinn cursed under her breath. This wasn't part of the plan. They were trapped. "Up there," Holloway said, pointing to a small access panel above their heads. "We can use the maintenance ducts. They'll lead us straight to the docking bay." Quinn wasted no time. They climbed up one by one, squeezing through the tight opening and into the maze of pipes and ventilation shafts. The air was stuffy and thick, but they didn't have the luxury to complain. Every minute they wasted was a minute closer to being caught. Inside the ducts, the crew moved swiftly, following Holloway's lead. They knew this part of the ship better than anyone. Holloway had mapped out the maintenance routes when they first arrived, anticipating the possibility of needing a quick escape. As they crawled through the tight space, Quinn couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The Scifi were fast, efficient. She had no doubt they were already tracking their movements. They were running on borrowed time. And the worst part? The Scifi had only just begun to show their true strength. The virus they had planted in their communications network had done its job disrupting their systems and creating chaos, but it hadn't crippled the flagship. It had only slowed them down. And the longer they stayed on the ship, the more they risked exposing themselves to the full power of the Scifi fleet. Quinn pushed those thoughts aside. Now wasn't the time for doubt. They had a plan, and they had to stick to it. "Almost there," Holloway called out from the front, his voice muffled by the ducts. Quinn nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The docking bay was their only hope, but she knew it wouldn't be easy to escape. Even if they made it there was no guarantee the Scifi wouldn't catch them first. She had to believe they could make it. They had no choice. Suddenly, a low, rumbling sound vibrated through the ducts, followed by a loud bang. Quinn's heart skipped a beat. "We're not alone," Holloway muttered. The rumbling grew louder, and then, as if on cue, a loud metallic screech echoed through the shaft. Quinn spun around, her heart racing. They were being pursued. She could hear footsteps fast, heavy, and closing in. "Run!" Quinn shouted, as she pushed forward, urging the rest of the crew to move faster. The maintenance ducts were narrow and claustrophobic, but they used every inch of space to their advantage, sliding through tight spots and scrambling up the shaft. The sound of pursuit grew closer, and Quinn could hear the heavy thud of boots behind them. The Scifi were right behind them, and they were not going to stop. Quinn reached the end of the duct and saw the faint glow of the docking bay ahead, but the entrance was locked, heavily reinforced with security systems. There was no time to break in. "Marcus, get the door open," Quinn shouted. "Now." Holloway moved to the control panel beside the door and began to hack into the system. His fingers moved quickly, his face set in a determined grimace. "We don't have much time," he said through gritted teeth. Quinn glanced over her shoulder. The sound of the Scifi was getting louder. They were closing in on them. The pressure was mounting. "Come on, Holloway," Quinn muttered under her breath. "Come on." Just as the footsteps reached the entrance of the shaft, Holloway slammed his hand on the control panel. The doors to the docking bay opened with a hiss, and Quinn didn't hesitate. She sprinted through the entrance, her crew following close behind. The docking bay was huge, with massive docking platforms stretching out in all directions. Quinn's ship was docked on the far side, the only one that could take them to safety, but there were guards stationed at the far end of the bay, blocking their path. Quinn's heart pounded in her chest as she assessed the situation. The Zindari were already there, their weapons drawn. There was no way they were getting through without a fight, but Quinn wasn't one to give up. She turned to her crew, her voice low but commanding. "We don't stop, we push through." The team moved into position, weapons raised, ready to fight. The Zindari guards noticed them immediately, and the firefight began. Quinn moved with precision, her training kicking in. They had to keep moving, keep fighting. Until they reached their ship, the Zindari fired back, their advanced weapons crackling with energy, but Quinn and her crew fought back harder. Every shot, every movement was calculated. They couldn't afford to miss. As they pushed forward, the guards were slowly overwhelmed. But the fight wasn't over. They were still outnumbered, and the Zindari fleet was moments away from arriving. Quinn had no illusions about the danger they were in. This was their final chance to escape. With one last push, they reached their ship. The hatch opened, and they quickly boarded, taking their positions as the ship's engines roared to life. The Zindari were already regrouping, but it was too late. "Launch the ship," Quinn ordered, her voice firm. The engines screamed as the ship lifted off, breaking free from the docking bay. They shot out into the stars, the Zindari flagship fading behind them. But Quinn knew this was just the beginning. They had escaped. For now, but she could feel the tension in the air. The Zindari wouldn't let them go easily. The war was far from over. Quinn stared out into the vastness of space, her hands gripping the controls. The journey ahead would be difficult, but they had made it this far, and she wasn't about to let anything stop them now.